Our timeline starts nearly 3 billion years ago, when we existed only as scattered atoms on Earth. Much later, around 6 million years ago, the first species from the hominin group emerged, early relatives of modern humans. At about 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus became the first of our kind to move out of Africa and settle across other continents. They showed signs of increased brain size compared to earlier primates. Roughly 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthals began to appear. They lived in colder regions of Europe and Western Asia and developed physical traits that made them more resilient to the climate. Their facial features resembled ours more than any other ancient species. Eventually, Homo sapiens came onto the scene, today's only surviving human species. What helped them stand apart was their ability to form organized communities. Around 40,000 years ago, the first cave paintings appeared in what is now Spain and France. At Lascaux and Altamira, early humans painted magnificent animals, horses, bison, and rocks on cave walls. These weren't just pictures. They were humanity's first attempts to capture and preserve their experiences, marking the beginning of art and symbolic thinking. During this same period, humans developed sophisticated tools. They crafted spear throwers called atla, which could launch projectiles with deadly accuracy. They learned to control fire not just for warmth, but for cooking, which made nutrients more accessible and may have contributed to brain development. They also created the first musical instruments. Bone flutes found in Germany date back 42,000 years. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended, and with it came dramatic changes. Massive creatures like woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths vanished. Some scientists believe human hunting contributed to these extinctions, while others point to climate change. Regardless, this mass extinction marked the end of the Pleistocene epoch and set the stage for human civilization. Around 4000 BCE, in Mesopotamia, people in the Sumerian city of Ur started living differently. Settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they no longer relied solely on hunting and collecting food. Instead, they learned to grow crops like barley and wheat, making these grains usable for meals. Involved tools like the hand mill, two stones used to crush grain into flour. This marked the beginning of agriculture, a key moment that changed how people lived. Populations grew, and Ur eventually reached over 50,000 residents. But this development also affected the human body. People became shorter, men from around 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 3 and women from about 5 feet 3 to 5 feet. Life became more stable but also less physically demanding, and people stayed in one area more often. In ancient Anatolia, around 7500 BCE, the remarkable city of Çatalhöyük emerged. This settlement housed up to 10,000 people in connected buildings with no streets. Residents entered their homes through holes in the roof. The walls were decorated with elaborate murals depicting hunting scenes, volcanic eruptions, and geometric patterns. The people of Çatalhöyük were among the first to domesticate cattle and practice extensive trade, exchanging obsidian tools and pottery across vast distances. Around 6000 BCE, in what is now Peru, the people of Caral built the first city in the Americas. This civilization predated the Egyptian pyramids by over 1,000 years. They constructed massive pyramid complexes, developed a sophisticated irrigation system, and created textiles from cotton, one of humanity's earliest examples of large-scale textile production. Remarkably, archaeologists have found no evidence of warfare at Caral, suggesting it was a peaceful trading center. Meanwhile, in China, around 5000 BCE, the Yangshao culture began cultivating millet and rice. They created the first Chinese pottery, featuring distinctive painted designs in red and black. Their villages were surrounded by defensive ditches, and they buried their dead with elaborate grave goods, indicating the development of social hierarchies and religious beliefs about the afterlife. Rome's rise from a small Italian city-state to ruler of the Mediterranean was remarkable. The Roman Republic's system of checks and balances with consuls, senate, and tribunes influenced many later democratic systems. Roman law, codified in the 12 Tables around 450 BCE, established principles of justice that still influence legal systems today. Roman engineering was equally impressive. They built over 250,000 miles of roads, with the saying, "all roads lead to Rome," reflecting their extensive network. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water to cities across the empire. The Pont du Gard in France, still standing today, could carry 200 million liters of water per day across a 50-kilometer route. The Punic Wars with Carthage were among the most important conflicts in ancient history. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps with elephants captured imaginations, but his ultimate defeat at Zama in 2020 BCE eliminated Rome's greatest rival and opened the path to empire. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul 58 to 50 BCE was a masterpiece of military strategy and political ambition. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars provide vivid accounts of Celtic society and Roman military tactics. The conquest brought wealth that funded Caesar's political rise and ultimately the transformation of Rome from republic to empire. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, ruled for 45 years and established the Pax Romana, Roman peace that lasted for 2 centuries. During this time, trade flourished, cities grew, and Roman culture spread throughout the empire. The historian Edward Gibbon famously wrote that the period from 96 to 80s was when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. The birth of Jesus, in Roman-controlled Palestine, occurred during this golden age. Christianity's spread throughout the Roman Empire was remarkable, from a small Jewish sect to the empire's official religion in just 3 centuries. The conversion of Emperor Constantine in 312 CE marked a turning point not just for Christianity, but for world history. Early Christian communities developed new forms of social organization. They cared for the poor, sick, and elderly regardless of social status. Revolutionary in a world where class distinctions were absolute. The monastic movement, beginning with Saint Anthony in Egypt around 270 CE, preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages and created new forms of communal living. The fall of Rome wasn't sudden, but gradual. Economic problems, including inflation and taxation, weakened the empire. Climate change may have pushed barbarian tribes to migrate south. The division of the empire into western and eastern halves in 2085 CE created competing centers of power. When Alaric sacked Rome in 410 CE, it shocked the ancient world. The Eternal City was no longer invincible. The Huns under Attila represented a new type of warfare. These nomadic peoples had lived on the steppes for centuries, perfecting cavalry tactics and siege warfare. Their composite bows could pierce armor at 300 yards, and their mobility allowed them to appear and disappear like ghosts. The Hun Confederation included not just Huns but Goths, Alans, and other tribes united under Attila's leadership. The Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, preserved Roman law and Greek culture for another 1,000 years. Emperor Justinian's reconquest of Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain briefly restored much of the old empire. His legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the foundation of law in much of Europe. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 57 CE, was the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years. Its massive dome seemed to float without support, inspiring the historian Procopius to write that it seems not to rest upon solid masonry, but to cover the space as though suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Meanwhile, Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula and transformed the world. Muhammad's peace be upon him teachings emphasized social justice, the unity of believers, and submission to Allah. The speed of Islamic expansion was breathtaking. Within a century, Muslim armies had conquered territories from Spain to Central Asia. The Islamic Golden Age, 8th–13th centuries, saw remarkable achievements in science, mathematics, philosophy, and medicine. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became the world's greatest center of learning. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra, while physicians like Al-Razi made advances in medicine that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The preservation and translation of Greek texts by Muslim scholars helped preserve classical knowledge for future generations. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, which remained the standard medical textbook in Europe for 600 years. Al-Battani's astronomical observations corrected errors in Ptolemy's work and influenced Copernicus. The mathematician Al-Biruni calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy and studied the speed of light. Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800 CE marked the beginning of medieval Europe's attempt to restore the Western Empire. His palace school at Aachen attracted scholars from across Europe, sparking the Carolingian Renaissance that preserved classical learning. The feudal system that emerged after Charlemagne's empire fragmented, created a complex web of personal relationship. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for military service, while peasants worked the land in exchange for protection. This system provided stability during uncertain times, but also entrenched social inequalities that would persist for centuries. The Viking Age, 1793 to 1066 CE, saw Scandinavian warriors, traders, and explorers spread across Europe and beyond. They established kingdoms in England and France, founded cities like Dublin and Kiev, and reached as far as North America and Constantinople. Their longships, with shallow drafts and square sails, could navigate both seas and rivers, giving them unprecedented mobility. Viking society was more complex than the popular image of bloodthirsty raiders suggests. They were skilled craftsmen producing intricate jewelry and weapons. Their poetry, preserved in the Eddas and Sagas, reveals a sophisticated culture that valued honor, loyalty, and storytelling. Women had more rights in Viking society than in most medieval cultures, including the right to divorce and own property. The Crusades, 1095–1291 CE, represented a unique fusion of religious fervor, military adventure, and economic opportunity. Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade at Clermont in 1095 promised spiritual rewards for those who fought to reclaim the Holy Land. The success of the First Crusade shocked the Muslim world and established Crusader states that lasted for 2 centuries. The Crusades had profound effects on both Christian and Muslim societies. They increased trade between East and West, introduced Europeans to new technologies and ideas, and led to the persecution of Jews in Europe. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 severely weakened the Byzantine Empire and contributed to its eventual fall. Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongol tribes created the largest contiguous empire in history. The Mongols' military innovations, composite bows, decimal organization, and psychological warfare made them nearly unstoppable. Their empire eventually stretched from Korea to Hungary, encompassing 12 million square miles. The Mongol Empire was more than just military conquest. The Pax Mongolica facilitated trade along the Silk Road, spreading technologies like gunpowder, printing, and the compass from China to Europe. The Mongols were remarkably tolerant of local religions and customs, often adopting the administrative systems of conquered peoples. In China, the Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan saw remarkable cultural achievements. Marco Polo's account of his travels to Kublai's court introduced Europeans to the wonders of Chinese civilization. The Yuan period saw advances in astronomy, mathematics, and literature, including the development of Chinese opera and the novel. The Islamic world during this period produced remarkable achievements despite Mongol invasions. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Abbasid Caliphate, but Islamic civilization continued to flourish in places like Cairo, Cordoba, and Delhi. The Mamluks in Egypt developed new military technologies and stopped Mongol expansion westward. In India, the Delhi Sultanate brought Islamic rule to much of the subcontinent. The massive architectural projects of rulers like Alauddin Khalji and Muhammad bin Tughlaq created some of the world's most beautiful monuments. The synthesis of Islamic and Hindu architectural styles produced the distinctive Indo-Islamic architectural tradition. The Renaissance began in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, where wealth from trade funded artistic and intellectual achievements. The rediscovery of classical texts, preserved by Islamic scholars, sparked new interest in human potential and achievement. Humanism emphasized individual dignity and the importance of earthly life, not just preparation for the afterlife. Leonardo da Vinci embodied the Renaissance ideal of the universal genius. His notebooks, written in mirror script, contained designs for helicopters, tanks, and submarines centuries before their invention. His anatomical studies, based on dissections of human corpses, advanced medical knowledge. The Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile continues to captivate viewers more than 500 years after its creation. Michelangelo's sculptures and paintings reached new heights of artistic achievement. His David represented the perfect human form, while the Sistine Chapel ceiling depicted the entire Christian story from creation to judgment. His architectural work on St. Peter's Basilica helped create one of the world's most recognizable buildings. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 revolutionized communication. Books became cheaper and more widely available, spreading literacy and new ideas. The Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455, marked the beginning of the age of mass communication. The Protestant Reformation challenged the Catholic Church's authority and changed European politics forever. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, posted in 1517, criticized church practices and sparked a movement that split Christianity permanently. John Calvin's teachings in Geneva created a new form of Christianity that emphasized predestination and moral discipline. The Catholic Counter-Reformation responded with the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, which clarified Catholic doctrine and reformed church practices. The Jesuit order, founded by Ignatius Loyola, became the Church's intellectual and missionary arm, establishing schools and missions worldwide. European exploration was driven by the search for new trade routes to Asia, the desire for gold and silver, and the mission to spread Christianity. Portuguese navigators pioneered ocean exploration, rounding Africa to reach India and establishing trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 connected the Old and New Worlds permanently. The Columbian Exchange that followed transformed both hemispheres. European diseases devastated Native American populations, while American crops like potatoes and maize revolutionized European agriculture. Silver from the Americas financed European wars and transformed the global economy. The Spanish conquistadors' destruction of the Aztec and Inca empires represented one of history's most dramatic cultural encounters. Advanced indigenous civilizations, isolated from the Old World for thousands of years, suddenly faced European technology, diseases, and imperial ambitions. The demographic catastrophe that followed was unprecedented. Some estimates suggest 90% of the indigenous population died within a century of contact. The Atlantic slave trade created the largest forced migration in human history. Between 1500 and 1870, approximately 12.5 million Africans were transported to the Americas. This system enriched European merchants and American planters while devastating African societies. The plantation system that developed in the Americas created new forms of racialized slavery that differed from earlier forms of bondage. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, became the world's first multinational corporation. Its control of the spice trade made the Netherlands the richest country in Europe. The company could wage war, negotiate treaties, and issue currency, powers normally reserved for sovereign states. The scientific revolution transformed humanity's understanding of the natural world. Nicolaus Copernicus's heliocentric theory placed the sun at the center of the solar system, challenging both classical astronomy and religious doctrine. Galileo's telescopic observations provided evidence for Copernican theory, while his conflict with the Inquisition highlighted the tension between science and religion. Johannes Kepler's laws of planetary motion showed that planets moved in elliptical orbits, not perfect circles. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, 1687, unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics, showing that the same laws governed motion on Earth and in the heavens. His law of universal gravitation explained everything from falling apples to planetary orbits. The scientific revolution wasn't just about astronomy and physics. Andreas Vesalius revolutionized anatomy, with detailed dissections that corrected errors in ancient tech. William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, while Antony van Leeuwenhoek's microscopes revealed a previously invisible world of microorganisms. The Enlightenment applied scientific thinking to human society. Philosophers like John Locke argued that governments derived their authority from the consent of the governed. Voltaire championed religious tolerance and freedom of speech. Montesquieu's theory of separation of powers influenced constitutional design. David Hume and Immanuel Kant pushed the boundaries of philosophical thinking about knowledge and reality. The Encyclopédie, edited by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, attempted to compile all human knowledge in a systematic way. This massive work, published between 1751 and 1772, spread Enlightenment ideas throughout Europe and America. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain around 1750, transforming manufacturing from handwork to machine production. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt, provided reliable power for factories and transportation. Textile production, once done in homes, moved to factories where workers operated power looms and spinning machines. The effects of industrialization were profound. Cities grew rapidly as people moved from farms to factories. New social classes emerged: industrial capitalists and factory workers. Working conditions were often harsh, with long hours, dangerous machinery, and child labor. The environmental impact was also severe, with pollution from coal-burning factories blackening the skies of industrial cities. The American Revolution 1775-1783 established the first modern republic based on Enlightenment principles. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution, with its system of checks and balances, became a model for democratic governments worldwide. The French Revolution 1789-1799 was even more radical, attempting to rebuild society from scratch. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed universal human rights. The revolution abolished feudalism, nationalized church property, and briefly established a republic. However, the Reign of Terror showed how revolutionary idealism could turn violent. Napoleon's rise from the chaos of the revolution created a new form of authoritarianism. His conquests spread revolutionary and Enlightenment ideas throughout Europe, while his legal code influenced law codes worldwide. The Napoleonic Wars, 1808-1803, involved most of Europe and marked the end of the old aristocratic order. The Haitian Revolution, 1791-1808-1804, was the only successful slave revolt in history. Led by Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, enslaved Africans defeated French, Spanish, and British forces to establish the First Black Republic. This revolution terrified slave owners throughout the Americas and inspired abolitionist movements. The 19th century saw the rise of nationalism as a powerful political force. The Greek War of Independence, 1821-1832, gained support throughout Europe as a struggle for freedom against Ottoman rule. The unification of Italy and Germany created new nation-states and upset the European balance of power. The abolition of slavery was one of the century's greatest moral achievements. Britain banned the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in its empire in 1833. The American Civil War, 1861-1865, ended slavery in the United States at a cost of over 600,000 lives. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in 1888. The Second Industrial Revolution, 1870-1914, brought electricity, steel production, and chemical industries. The internal combustion engine led to automobiles and airplanes. Telegraph cables connected continents, while the first telephone calls revolutionized communication. The discovery of electromagnetic waves led to radio, transforming news and entertainment. European imperialism reached its peak during this period. The scramble for Africa saw European powers divide the continent among themselves with little regard for existing societies. The construction of the Suez Canal, 1869, shortened the route to Asia and increased European control over global trade. The Opium Wars forced China to open its markets to Western trade and influence. Social reform movements gained momentum throughout the century. The women's suffrage movement demanded political rights for women. Labor unions fought for better working conditions and shorter hours. Socialist and anarchist movements proposed alternatives to capitalism. The first public health measures addressed the unsanitary conditions of industrial cities. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in On the Origin of Species, 1859, revolutionized biology and challenged religious beliefs about human origins. Karl Marx's analysis of capitalism in Das Kapital predicted class struggle and revolution. Sigmund Freud's studies of the unconscious mind created the field of psychoanalysis. World War I, 1914-1918, shattered the old European order and introduced industrial-scale warfare. Machine guns, poison gas, and artillery made traditional tactics obsolete. Trench warfare on the Western Front epitomized the war's senseless slaughter. The war's end brought the collapse of four empires: German, Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman, and redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. The Russian Revolution 1917 established the world's first communist state. Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power and withdrew Russia from World War I. The subsequent Civil War, 1918–1921, cost millions of lives and established the Soviet Union as a new type of society, based on Marxist ideology. The interwar period saw economic prosperity followed by the Great Depression, 1929–1939, the worst economic crisis in modern history. Unemployment reached 25% in the United States and even higher in some European countries. The crisis discredited capitalism and democracy in many people's minds, contributing to the rise of fascism and communism. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany led to World War II 1939–1945, the most destructive conflict in human history. The war introduced new forms of warfare, blitzkrieg tactics, strategic bombing, and eventually nuclear weapons. The Holocaust systematically murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others, representing an unprecedented crime against humanity. The war's end brought the division of Europe and the beginning of the Cold War, 1947–1991, between the United States and Soviet Union. This ideological struggle shaped global politics for nearly half a century, leading to proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The nuclear arms race created the possibility of human extinction for the first time in history. Decolonization transformed the world map as European empires collapsed. India gained independence in 1947, though partition created Pakistan and led to massive population movements and violence. African independence movements gained momentum in the 1960s, creating dozens of new nations. The process wasn't always peaceful. Wars in Algeria, Vietnam, and other colonies cost millions of lives. The space race captured global imagination and demonstrated technological prowess. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, while the United States landed on the moon in 1969. Neil Armstrong's first steps on the lunar surface represented humanity's greatest adventure and showed what human cooperation could achieve. The civil rights movement in the United States challenged racial segregation and inspired similar movements worldwide. Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolent resistance helped achieve landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act 1964 and Voting Rights Act 1965. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s challenged gender inequality and transformed social relations. The environmental movement emerged as humans recognized their impact on the planet. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, exposed the dangers of pesticides, while the first Earth Day 1970 raised awareness about pollution and conservation. The discovery of the ozone hole and evidence of climate change showed that human activities could affect the entire planet. The development of the personal computer revolutionized information processing and communication. The Internet, originally a military research project, became a global network connecting billions of people. The World Wide Web, created by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, made information instantly accessible worldwide. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War and the triumph of democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 left the United States as the world's sole superpower. However, new challenges emerged: terrorism, ethnic conflicts, and economic inequality. Globalization connected the world economy as never before. International trade expanded dramatically, while multinational corporations operated across borders. The Internet enabled instant communication and created new forms of work and entertainment. However, globalization also increased inequality and made local economies vulnerable to global economic shocks. The 21st century began with the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack, which killed nearly 3,000 people and launched the War on Terror. The subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq marked a new phase of American intervention in the Middle East. The rise of new terrorist organizations like ISIS showed that asymmetric warfare would continue to challenge traditional military power. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the fragility of the global economic system. Banks that were too big to fail required government bailouts, while millions of people lost their homes and jobs. The crisis led to increased government regulation of financial markets and renewed debate about capitalism's sustainability. Climate change emerged as perhaps the greatest challenge facing humanity. The greenhouse effect, first identified in the 19th century, became a reality as global temperatures rose due to human carbon emissions. The melting of polar ice caps, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events demonstrated that human activities could alter the planet's climate system. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2019 showed how interconnected the modern world had become. A virus that emerged in Wuhan, China, spread globally within months, killing millions and shutting down the world economy. The rapid development of vaccines using new mRNA technology demonstrated human ingenuity, while the pandemic's unequal impact highlighted global inequalities. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram transformed human communication and politics. These platforms enabled instant global communication and helped organize social movements, but they also spread misinformation and contributed to political polarization. The rise of fake news and alternative facts challenged the very concept of objective truth. Artificial intelligence and machine learning began to transform many aspects of human life. Computers could now recognize faces, translate languages, and even create art and literature. However, AI also raised concerns about job displacement, privacy, and the concentration of power in the hands of a few technology companies. The rise of China as an economic superpower challenged American dominance and created new geopolitical tensions. China's Belt and Road Initiative aimed to create new trade routes connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. The competition between the United States and China for technological supremacy, particularly in areas like semiconductors and 5G networks, created a new form of Cold War. While Europe and Asia developed their civilizations, the Americas saw remarkable achievements, often overlooked, in world history. The Olmec civilization, 1200–400 BCE, in Mexico created the first writing system in the Americas, and carved massive stone heads, some weighing over 40 tons. Their influence spread throughout Mesoamerica, laying the foundation for later civilizations. The Maya civilization, 2000 BCE, 1500 CE, achieved remarkable advances in astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. They developed the concept of zero independently and created the most accurate calendar in the ancient world. Their cities like Tikal and Palenque featured massive pyramids and intricate stone carvings that recorded their history and beliefs. Mayan writing was the most advanced in the pre-Columbian Americas, with over 800 hieroglyphic symbols representing sounds, syllables, and concepts. The recent decipherment of Mayan texts has revealed a complex civilization with sophisticated political systems, trade networks, and religious beliefs. The mysterious collapse of many Mayan cities around 900 CE remains a subject of scholarly debate. The Inca Empire, 1438–1533 CE, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, stretching along the western coast of South America for over 2,500 miles. Without wheels, written language, or iron tools, the Incas built an empire of over 10 million people connected by an extensive road system through some of the world's most challenging terrain. Inca engineering achievements included Machu Picchu, city built at 8,000 feet above sea level with stones fitted so precisely that a knife blade cannot fit between them. Their agricultural terraces allowed farming on steep mountain slopes, while their Quipu recording system used knotted strings to keep administrative records. The Aztec Empire, 1428–1521 CE, controlled much of central Mexico from their island capital of Tenochtitlan. Built on Lake Texcoco, the city was larger than any European city of its time, with a population of over 200,000. Chinampas floating gardens fed the population, while an extensive tribute system brought wealth from conquered territories. Aztec society was highly stratified, with elaborate religious ceremonies that included human sacrifice. Their calendar stone, weighing over 24 tons, demonstrated sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés in 1519 brought this civilization to a sudden and violent end. In North America, various indigenous civilizations thrived for thousands of years before European contact. The ancestral Puebloans, formerly called Anasazi, built elaborate cliff dwellings in the American Southwest. Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon featured multi-story buildings with sophisticated water management systems. The Mississippian culture, 801–1600 CE, built large earthen mounds throughout the southeastern United States. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was North America's largest pre-Columbian city, with a population that may have reached 20,000. The city's central mound, Monk's Mound, is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Africa's rich history extends far beyond ancient Egypt, though many of these civilizations remain lesser known. The Kingdom of Kush, 1070 BCE, 350 CE, in present-day Sudan, controlled the Nile trade routes and even conquered Egypt for a period. Kushite pharaohs ruled as the 25th dynasty of Egypt, building more pyramids than their Egyptian predecessors. The Kingdom of Aksum, 100 to 960 CE, in modern Ethiopia, was a major trading power that controlled routes between the Roman Empire and ancient India. Aksum was one of the first nations to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion. The giant stelae of Aksum, some over 100 feet tall, remain among Africa's most impressive monuments. The Ghana Empire, 300 to 1200 CE, controlled the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade, becoming fabulously wealthy. Located in present-day Mali and Burkina Faso, Ghana was known throughout the medieval world for its gold. The empire's capital, Kumbi-Sele, was a cosmopolitan city that attracted traders from across North Africa. The Mali Empire, 1275 to 1600 CE, succeeded Ghana and became even more powerful. Under Mansa Musa, 1312–1337 CE, Mali became the richest empire in the world. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324–1325 distributed so much gold in Cairo that it depressed the metal's value for a decade. Timbuktu became a center of Islamic learning, with the University of Sankore housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. The Songhai Empire, 1464–1491 CE, was the largest empire in African history, controlling territory along the Niger River. Cities like Gao and Timbuktu became centers of trade and learning. The empire's military used cavalry and iron weapons effectively until its defeat by Moroccan forces armed with firearms. Great Zimbabwe, 1214–1450 CE, in southern Africa, was a powerful trading state that controlled the gold trade between the interior and the Indian Ocean coast. The massive stone structures that give the country its modern name were built without mortar, demonstrating sophisticated engineering skills. The city was home to an estimated 18,000 people at its peak. The Swahili city-states along the East African coast developed a unique culture blending African, Arab and Persian influences. Cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Mogadishu became wealthy through trade in gold, ivory and slaves. The Swahili language, a Bantu language with many Arabic loanwords, became the lingua franca of East African trade. The Mongol Empire's influence extended far beyond military conquest. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols created the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. This vast empire facilitated unprecedented cultural and technological exchange. The Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, made travel along the Silk Road safer than it had been for centuries. Marco Polo's journey to China was possible because of Mongol protection. The Mongols established the first international postal system, with relay stations allowing rapid communication across their empire. Mongol tolerance of different religions and cultures was remarkable for its time. They adopted useful practices from conquered peoples, including Chinese administrative systems, Islamic architectural techniques, and European military technologies. This cultural synthesis enriched all parts of the empire. The Mongol conquests also had devastating effects. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Islamic Golden Age. The siege of Kiev in 1240 devastated the city so completely that a traveler 6 years later found only 200 houses remaining from a once great metropolis. Some historians estimate that the Mongol conquests reduced the global population by as much as 11%. The empire's fragmentation after 1260 created several successor states. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, saw remarkable cultural achievements including the development of drama and the novel. The Ilkhanate in Persia promoted artistic and architectural innovations. The Golden Horde controlled the Russian principalities for over 2 centuries, profoundly influencing Russian culture and politics. The Islamic Golden Age, 8th, 13th centuries, represented one of history's greatest periods of scientific and cultural achievement. Baghdad's House of Wisdom became the world's premier center of learning, where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic while making original discoveries. Islamic mathematics made fundamental contributions to human knowledge. Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra gave the field its name, from the Arabic al-Jabr. The adoption of Hindu Arabic numerals, including the concept of zero, revolutionized mathematics and commerce. Islamic mathematicians also advanced trigonometry and made progress in understanding infinite series. Islamic medicine surpassed anything available in medieval Europe. Al-Rizi, known in the West as Rhazes, wrote the first accurate description of smallpox and measles. Ibn Sina's Avicenna Canon of Medicine remained the standard medical textbook in Europe for 600 years. Islamic physicians performed cataract surgery, developed new surgical instruments, and established the first hospitals with medical schools. Islamic astronomy made crucial advances that would later influence Copernicus and other European astronomers. Al-Battani's observations corrected errors in Ptolemy's work, while Al-Biruni calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Islamic astronomers also improved the astrolabe and developed new mathematical techniques for astronomical calculations. The preservation and translation movement in the Islamic world saved many classical texts that would otherwise have been lost. Works by Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy were translated into Arabic and later retranslated into Latin, preserving Greek learning through the European Dark Ages. Islamic architecture developed distinctive styles that influenced buildings worldwide. The pointed arch, later adopted in Gothic architecture, was perfected in Islamic buildings. The use of geometric patterns and calligraphy created a unique aesthetic that avoided figural representation in religious contexts. The Renaissance wasn't just about art and literature, it represented a fundamental shift in how Europeans viewed the world and their place in it. Humanism emphasized human dignity and potential, challenging medieval views that focused primarily on the afterlife. This intellectual movement laid the groundwork for modern ideas about individual rights and scientific inquiry. The printing revolution transformed how knowledge was transmitted. By 1500, European printing presses had produced over 20 million books, more than all the scribes of Europe had produced in the previous 1,000 years. This democratization of knowledge accelerated the spread of new ideas and contributed to the Protestant Reformation and scientific revolution. The scientific revolution challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural world. Copernicus's heliocentric theory displaced Earth from the center of the universe. Galileo's telescopic observations revealed mountains on the moon and moons around Jupiter, proving that celestial bodies weren't perfect spheres. Kepler's laws showed that planetary orbits were elliptical, not circular. The invention of new scientific instruments accelerated discovery. The telescope revolutionized astronomy, while the microscope revealed a previously invisible world of microorganisms. Improved clocks allowed more precise timing of events, crucial for astronomical observations and navigation. The development of the scientific method provided a systematic approach to understanding nature. Francis Bacon advocated empirical observation and experimentation, while René Descartes emphasized mathematical reasoning. This combination of observation, experimentation, and mathematical analysis became the foundation of modern science. Newton's Principia Mathematica, 1687, represented the culmination of the scientific revolution. His law of universal gravitation unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics, showing that the same physical laws governed all motion. His work provided a mathematical framework that could predict natural phenomena with unprecedented accuracy. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain, due to several factors: abundant coal deposits, colonial markets, accumulated capital from trade, and a relatively free political system that encouraged innovation. The textile industry led the way, as new machines like the spinning jenny and power loom dramatically increased productivity. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt in the 1760s, provided reliable power that didn't depend on water or wind. Steam power enabled factories to be built anywhere, and later powered locomotives and steamships, revolutionizing transportation. The development of iron and steel production provided materials for machinery, railways, and buildings. The social consequences of industrialization were profound and often disruptive. The factory system required workers to labor according to clock time rather than seasonal rhythms. Child labor became common as factory owners sought cheap workers for simple tasks. Cities grew rapidly as people moved from rural areas to find factory work, often living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The working class that emerged from industrialization developed new forms of solidarity and organization. Trade unions fought for better wages and working conditions, despite legal restrictions and employer opposition. The Luddites famously destroyed machinery they blamed for unemployment, while Chartists demanded political rights for working men. Women's roles changed dramatically during industrialization. Factory work offered some women economic independence, but working conditions were often harsh. The doctrine of separate spheres confined middle-class women to domestic roles while men engaged in business and politics. However, women also became active in reform movements, including abolitionism and temperance. The environmental consequences of industrialization were severe. Coal burning polluted the air in industrial cities, creating health problems and environmental damage. Rivers became polluted with industrial waste, while countryside was transformed by mining and railroad construction. These environmental costs wouldn't be fully recognized until the 20th century. The 19th century saw the rise of nationalism as a powerful political force that reshaped the map of Europe. The concept that people sharing a common language, culture, and history should form their own nation-state challenged the old dynastic system, where rulers governed diverse populations. German unification was achieved through a combination of economic integration and military conquest. The Zollverein customs union created economic ties between German states, while Prussian military victories against Denmark, Austria, and France demonstrated Prussian leadership. Otto von Bismarck's diplomacy isolated France and created conditions for German unity under Prussian leadership. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870–1871, completed German unification and dramatically altered the European balance of power. The German Empire proclaimed at Versailles humiliated France and created lasting resentment. The war's aftermath included the Paris Commune, a radical experiment in workers' government that was brutally suppressed. Italian unification, the Risorgimento, was achieved through a combination of popular uprisings, diplomatic maneuvering, and military campaigns. Giuseppe Garibaldi's expedition of the Thousand liberated Sicily and southern Italy, while the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia provided political leadership. The process wasn't completed until 1870, when Rome became the capital. The unification of Germany and Italy disrupted the European balance of power established at the Congress of Vienna 1815. The new German Empire became Europe's dominant military and economic power, while a unified Italy emerged as a potential great power. These changes contributed to the alliance system that would lead to World War I. Nationalism also created problems for multi-ethnic empires. The Austrian Empire faced growing demands for autonomy from Hungarians, Czechs, and other national groups. The Ottoman Empire struggled with nationalist movements among Greeks, Bulgarians, and other Balkan peoples. These tensions would eventually contribute to the outbreak of World War I. The late 19th century saw a new phase of European imperialism, driven by economic competition, national prestige, and technological advantages. The development of steamships, railways, and telegraphs made it easier to control distant territories. Medical advances, particularly the use of quinine to prevent malaria, reduced the mortality rates of Europeans in tropical climates. The Berlin Conference, 1884–1885, established rules for European colonization of Africa, requiring effective occupation rather than mere claims. This triggered the scramble for Africa, as European powers rushed to claim territory. Within 30 years, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. The economic motives for imperialism were complex. While colonies provided markets for manufactured goods and sources of raw materials, many were not profitable. The search for investment opportunities and strategic advantages often outweighed immediate economic benefit. National prestige and the belief in a civilizing mission also motivated imperial expansion. The human costs of imperialism were enormous. King Leopold II's rule in the Congo Free State resulted in millions of deaths through forced labor, violence, and disease. The Hero and Namaqua genocide in German Southwest Africa, 1904-1907, was one of the 20th century's first genocides. Colonial rule disrupted traditional societies and economies throughout Africa and Asia. Resistance to imperialism took many forms. The Ethiopian victory over Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa, 1896, preserved Ethiopian independence and inspired resistance movements worldwide. The Boxer Rebellion in China, 1899-9991, attempted to expel foreign influence. In India, the Indian National Congress began demanding greater self-government. The impact of imperialism extended beyond politics and economics to culture and ideas. Orientalism, as described by Edward Said, shaped how Europeans viewed Asian and African societies. Scientific racism provided pseudo-scientific justification for imperial rule. However, contact between cultures also led to new forms of art, literature, and thought. World War I began as a European conflict, but became the first truly global war, involving countries from every continent. The complex alliance system meant that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a cascade of declarations of war. What many expected to be a short conflict became a 4-year war of attrition. New military technologies made World War I uniquely deadly. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute, making frontal assaults suicidal. Poison gas was first used on a large scale, causing horrific casualties. Artillery bombardments could be heard hundreds of miles away. The war introduced tanks, aircraft, and submarines as major weapons of war. The Western Front epitomized the war's futility. Opposing armies faced each other from elaborate trench systems stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. The space between trenches, known as no man's land, was swept by machine gun fire and artillery. Attempts to break through enemy lines typically gained a few miles at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. The war's global nature brought fighting to Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific. The Gallipoli Campaign 1915-1916 attempted to open a route to Russia through the Ottoman Empire but failed with heavy casualties. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by T. Lawrence of Arabia, contributed to Ottoman defeat but also created conflicting promises about post-war Middle Eastern borders. The Russian Revolution in 1917 removed Russia from the war, but also introduced a new ideological element. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread to war-weary Russians. Their separate peace with Germany freed German troops for the Western Front, but American entry into the war in 1917 ultimately tipped the balance. The war's end brought the collapse of 4 empires: German, Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms on Germany, including massive reparations and territorial losses. New nations emerged from the ruins of empires, but the peace settlement created new conflicts that would lead to World War II. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was actually 2 revolutions. The February Revolution overthrew Tsar Nicholas II and established a provisional government. The October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power under Vladimir Lenin. This second revolution was one of the most significant events in modern history, creating the world's first socialist state. Lenin's new economic policy 1921-1928 temporarily allowed market mechanisms to revive the economy after the devastation of war and civil war. However, Stalin's rise to power after Lenin's death in 1924 led to a more radical transformation. The first 5-year plan, 1928-1932, aimed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union through central planning. Collectivization of agriculture, 1929-1932, forced peasants into collective farms, destroying traditional rural life. The policy was implemented with extreme violence, leading to famine that killed millions. The Ukrainian famine of 1932-1933, known as the Holodomor, is considered by many historians to be a genocide. Stalin's purges, 1936-1938, eliminated millions of perceived enemies, including many old Bolsheviks who had participated in the revolution. The show trials of prominent party members created an atmosphere of terror. that pervaded Soviet society. The purges weakened the Red Army just before World War II. Despite its human costs, the Soviet system achieved rapid industrialization. The USSR transformed from a largely agricultural society to a major industrial power within 2 decades. Soviet achievements in education, healthcare, and women's rights were significant. Even as political freedoms were severely restricted, the Soviet model influenced communist movements worldwide. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, adapted Soviet ideas to Chinese conditions. Communist parties in other countries looked to the Soviet Union as a model, though many later developed their own interpretations of Marxism-Leninism. Fascism emerged in the aftermath of World War I, appealing to those who felt betrayed by the peace settlement and threatened by socialism. Benito Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922 brought fascists to power in Italy. Adolf Hitler's rise in Germany was more gradual, taking advantage of economic crisis and political instability. Nazi ideology combined extreme nationalism with racial theories that portrayed Jews and other groups as threats to German purity. The Holocaust began with legal discrimination but escalated to systematic murder. The final solution aimed to exterminate all European Jews, ultimately killing 6 million Jews and millions of others. World War II was even more global than World War I, with fighting on every continent except Antarctica. The German Blitzkrieg lightning war tactics quickly conquered much of Europe. The Battle of Britain 1940 was the first major German defeat, as the Royal Air Force prevented German invasion of Britain. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 opened a second front that proved decisive. Despite initial successes that brought German forces to the outskirts of Moscow, the invasion ultimately failed. The Battle of Stalingrad 1942-1943 marked the turning point on the Eastern Front, where most of the war's fighting and casualties occurred. The Pacific War began with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, bringing the United States fully into the conflict. The war in the Pacific featured new forms of warfare, including aircraft carrier battles and amphibious landings on fortified islands. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 ended the war, but introduced a new era of nuclear weapons. The war's aftermath reshaped the global order. The United Nations was created to prevent future wars. The Nuremberg trials established precedents for international justice. The division of Germany and the emergence of the Cold War between former allies marked the beginning of a new era of international relations. The process of decolonization accelerated after World War II, as European powers weakened and colonized peoples demanded independence. The war had discredited European claims of racial superiority and demonstrated that European powers could be defeated by non-European forces. Indian independence in 1947 was one of the most significant decolonization events. The partition of British India into India and Pakistan led to massive population movements and communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands. Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent resistance had helped achieve independence, but couldn't prevent the tragedy of partition. The Indonesian National Revolution, 1945-1949, established Indonesia's independence from Dutch rule. The conflict involved guerrilla warfare and international diplomatic pressure. Indonesia's independence inspired other independence movements in Southeast Asia. African decolonization accelerated in the 1960s. Ghana's independence in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah, marked the beginning of the end for European rule in Africa. The Year of Africa, 1960, saw 17 African countries gain independence. However, the process wasn't always peaceful. Wars in Algeria, Kenya, and other colonies involved significant violence. The Algerian War, 1954-1962, was one of the most brutal decolonization conflicts. The French considered Algeria part of France rather than a colony, leading to an 8-year war that killed over 1 million people. The conflict brought down the Fourth French Republic and brought Charles de Gaulle to power. The end of Portuguese colonial rule in Africa came later, with independence for Angola and Mozambique in 1975. After long guerrilla wars, These countries then became battlegrounds in Cold War proxy conflicts, showing how decolonization became entangled with superpower rivalry. The Cold War began as disagreements over post-war Europe escalated into global ideological conflict. The Truman Doctrine, 1947, committed the United States to containing communist expansion, while the Marshall Plan provided economic aid to rebuild Western Europe. The Soviet Union responded by tightening control over Eastern Europe. The Berlin Blockade 1948–1949 was the first major Cold War crisis. Soviet forces blocked access to West Berlin, leading to a massive airlift that supplied the city for nearly a year. The crisis demonstrated both superpowers' commitment to their positions and the dangers of confrontation. The Korean War 1950–1953 was the first major hot war of the Cold War era. Chinese intervention prevented a complete UN victory, leading to a stalemate and divided Korea that persists today. The war showed that Cold War conflicts could involve massive conventional forces and threaten to escalate to nuclear warfare. The development of hydrogen bombs in the early 1950s exponentially increased nuclear destructive power. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MADI, assumed that the threat of nuclear retaliation would prevent nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, brought the world closer to nuclear war than any other Cold War event. The space race captured global attention and demonstrated technological prowess. Soviet achievements like Sputnik 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's first human spaceflight 1961 shocked Americans and led to increased investment in science education. The American moon landing in 1969 represented the program's greatest achievement. The Vietnam War 1955–1975 became a defining Cold War conflict. American involvement escalated gradually, but the war ultimately ended in defeat and withdrawal. The conflict divided American society and demonstrated the limits of military power in guerrilla warfare. The 1960s saw unprecedented social upheaval in many countries. The civil rights movement in the United States challenged racial segregation and discrimination. Martin Luther King Jr., as philosophy of non-violent resistance, achieved major legislative victories. But his assassination in 1968 marked the end of the movement's most hopeful period. The women's liberation movement challenged traditional gender roles and demanded equal rights. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963, articulated many women's dissatisfaction with domestic roles. The movement achieved important legal victories, including reproductive rights and workplace equality laws. Student movements worldwide challenged authority and demanded social change. The May 1968 events in Paris nearly brought down the government and inspired similar movements worldwide. Students protested against university authoritarianism, the Vietnam War, and social inequality. The counterculture movement rejected mainstream values and experimented with alternative lifestyles. The hippie movement promoted peace, love, and drug experimentation. Woodstock, 1969, epitomized the movement's ideals, bringing together 400,000 people for music and peaceful coexistence. The environmental movement emerged as awareness of ecological problems grew. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, exposed the dangers of pesticides and helped launch the modern environmental movement. The first Earth Day 1970 brought environmental concerns into mainstream politics. The gay rights movement gained momentum after the Stonewall Riots 1969 in New York City. Previously marginalized and persecuted, LGBTQ individuals began demanding equal rights and social acceptance. The movement achieved significant legal and social progress over subsequent decades. The Cold War ended more suddenly than anyone predicted. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring were intended to revitalize the Soviet system, but instead unleashed forces that destroyed it. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War division of Europe. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 left the United States as the world's sole superpower. However, this unipolar moment was brief, as new challenges emerged from globalization, terrorism, and the rise of new powers like China. Globalization accelerated with the end of the Cold War as barriers to trade and investment fell. The internet connected people worldwide and enabled new forms of work and entertainment. Multinational corporations operated across borders, While global supply chains linked producers and consumers worldwide, the benefits of globalization were unevenly distributed. While global poverty declined and living standards improved in many countries, inequality within countries often increased. The digital divide separated those with access to new technologies from those without. Economic crises demonstrated globalization's risks. The Asian financial crisis 1997 showed how rapidly capital flows could destabilize economies. The 2008 global financial crisis revealed the interconnectedness of global financial markets and the potential for local problems to become global crises. The rise of China as an economic superpower challenged Western assumptions about development and governance. China's market reforms after 1978 lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty while maintaining Communist Party control. China's growth model inspired other developing countries but also created new tensions with established powers. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks marked the beginning of a new era focused on terrorism and security. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and led to the War on Terror, including invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. These conflicts showed the difficulties of nation-building and the persistence of asymmetric warfare. The 2008 financial crisis was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, caused by risky lending practices and financial deregulation. The crisis required massive government interventions to prevent economic collapse. The crisis led to increased regulation, but also contributed to political polarization and populist movements. Climate change emerged as perhaps the greatest long-term challenge facing humanity. Scientific consensus confirmed that human activities were warming the planet and changing weather patterns. International efforts to address climate change, including the Paris Agreement 2015, represented unprecedented global cooperation, but progress remained insufficient. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2019 demonstrated both human vulnerability and resilience. The virus spread globally within months, killing millions and disrupting the world economy. However, vaccines were developed in record time using new technologies, showing the potential of scientific cooperation. Technological change accelerated with the development of artificial intelligence, robotics, and biotechnology. These technologies offered tremendous benefits but also raised concerns about job displacement, privacy, and inequality. The concentration of technological power in a few companies created new forms of economic and political influence. Social media transformed communication and politics, but also contributed to the spread of misinformation and political polarization. The Arab Spring, 2010-2012 showed social media's potential for organizing political movements, but subsequent events revealed the limitations of technology-driven political change. As we look back over the vast sweep of human history, certain patterns emerge. Civilizations rise and fall, technologies advance and sometimes regress, and human nature remains remarkably consistent across cultures and millennia. The story of humanity is one of gradual progress punctuated by setbacks, achievements shadowed by failures, and hopes tempered by tragedy. The development of agriculture allowed permanent settlements and population growth, but also created inequality and environmental degradation. The rise of cities enabled specialization and cultural advancement, but also fostered disease and social stratification. The invention of writing preserved knowledge but also enabled propaganda and social control. Throughout history, human beings have struggled with the same fundamental questions. How should we organize society? What is the relationship between individual freedom and collective security? How can we live in harmony with our environment? These questions remain as relevant today as they were to the builders of the first cities. The acceleration of change in recent centuries has been unprecedented. The Industrial Revolution transformed human society more rapidly than any previous development. The 20th century saw 2 world wars, the rise and fall of ideologies, the development of nuclear weapons, and the beginning of space exploration. The 21st century has brought the internet, artificial intelligence, and global climate change. Yet beneath these dramatic changes, human nature remains constant. People still seek security, meaning, and connection with others. They still struggle with greed, fear, and prejudice. They still show remarkable creativity, compassion, and courage in the face of adversity. Perhaps the most important lesson from history is that change is constant and often unpredictable. The fall of the Roman Empire seemed impossible to those living within it. The rapid collapse of the Soviet Union surprised even its keenest observers. The speed of technological change continues to accelerate, making prediction increasingly difficult. As we face the challenges of the 21st century: climate change, technological disruption, inequality, and political polarization, history provides both warnings and hope. It warns us that civilizations can collapse, that progress is not inevitable, and that human beings are capable of great cruelty. But it also shows us that humans can overcome seemingly impossible challenges, that societies can reform themselves, and that individuals can make a difference. The story of Gilgamesh, written over 4,000 years ago, remains relevant today because it addresses timeless human concerns about mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning. Like Gilgamesh, we must accept that individual life is finite. But unlike him, we can take comfort in knowing that human civilization continues, building on the achievements of previous generations while facing new challenges with ancient wisdom and modern tools. The future remains unwritten, shaped by the choices we make today. As we stand at the threshold of new technologies and face unprecedented global challenges, we carry with us the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human experience. The story of humanity continues, and we are all its authors. The development of the microprocessor in 1971 launched the personal computer revolution. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Intel transformed computing from room-sized machines used by specialists into desktop tools for everyone. The introduction of the Apple Tiffin in 1977 and the IBM PC in 1981 brought computers into homes and offices worldwide. The creation of the Internet revolutionized human communication more profoundly than the printing press. Originally developed as AOPANET by the US military in 1969, the Internet became publicly accessible in the 1990s. Tim Berners-Lee's invention of the World Wide Web in 1989 created an easy way to access and share information globally. Email transformed business communication, while instant messaging changed personal relationships. The ability to communicate instantly with anyone, anywhere in the world, created new forms of community and collaboration. However, it also led to information overload and decreased face-to-face interaction. The dot-com boom of the 1990s saw massive investment in internet companies, many of which had no clear path to profitability. The bubble burst in 2000, wiping out trillions in market value, but surviving companies like Amazon and Google became some of the world's most valuable corporations. Social media platforms transformed how people interact and consume information. Facebook, launched in 2004, connected billions of people worldwide. Twitter enabled real-time global conversations, while Instagram changed how people share visual experiences. These platforms democratized publishing, but also created new forms of addiction and mental health issues. The smartphone revolution, launched by Apple's iPhone in 2007, put powerful computers in everyone's pocket. Smartphones enabled constant connectivity, GPS navigation, digital photography, and access to vast amounts of information. They also created new forms of surveillance and social pressure. E-commerce fundamentally altered retail and consumer behavior. Amazon, starting as an online bookstore, became a global marketplace that threatened traditional retail. The convenience of online shopping accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic, permanently changing consumer habit. The gig economy, enabled by platforms like Uber and Airbnb, created new forms of work that offered flexibility but often lacked traditional employee protections. This shift reflected broader changes in the nature of work, as automation and globalization eliminated many traditional jobs while creating new ones requiring different skills. Artificial intelligence evolved from science fiction to everyday reality. Machine learning algorithms began recognizing speech, translating languages, and making recommendations. AI systems defeated human champions in chess, Go, and other complex games, demonstrating capabilities that once seemed uniquely human. The development of quantum computing promised to solve problems impossible for traditional computers. While still in early stages, quantum computers could revolutionize cryptography, drug discovery, and scientific modeling. China and the United States competed intensely to achieve quantum supremacy. Biotechnology advances enabled new medical treatments and raised ethical questions about human enhancement. CRISPR gene editing technology allowed precise modification of DNA, potentially eliminating genetic diseases but also raising concerns about designer babies. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, mapped all human genes and opened new possibilities for personalized medicine. The end of the Cold War accelerated economic globalization as barriers to trade and investment fell worldwide. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1994, created a massive free trade zone, while the World Trade Organization, WTO, established global rules for international commerce. Manufacturing shifted to countries with lower labor costs, particularly China, which became the world's factory. This shift created prosperity in developing countries but also led to job losses in developed nations. The term Rust Belt described former industrial regions in the American Midwest that never fully recovered from deindustrialization. Global supply chains connected producers and consumers across continents. A smartphone might contain components made in dozens of countries, assembled in China, and sold worldwide. This efficiency reduced costs but also created vulnerabilities as disruptions in one location could affect production globally. International migration increased as people sought economic opportunities and fled conflicts. An estimated 81 million people lived outside their birth countries by 2020. Migration provided economic benefits but also created social tensions and political backlash in destination countries. Cultural globalization spread American movies, music, and food worldwide, while also enabling the global spread of other cultures. K-pop from South Korea, Bollywood films from India, and anime from Japan gained worldwide audiences. However, this cultural exchange also led to concerns about the loss of local traditions. The 2008 financial crisis revealed globalization's risks. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in New York triggered a global recession, showing how interconnected financial markets had become. The crisis led to massive government bailouts and increased regulation, but also contributed to growing inequality and political polarization. Anti-globalization movements emerged across the political spectrum. The World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999 brought together environmental, labor, and human rights activists. Later, populist politicians like Donald Trump and Brexit supporters argued that globalization harmed working-class communities. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed both globalization's benefits and vulnerabilities, while international scientific cooperation enabled rapid vaccine development. Closed borders and disrupted supply chains showed how quickly global systems could break down. The pandemic accelerated some aspects of globalization like remote work, while reversing others like international travel. China's economic reforms, beginning with Deng Xiaoping in 1978, transformed the global economy. The decision to open special economic zones allowed market mechanisms, while maintaining Communist Party control. This unique model lifted over 800 million people out of poverty, the largest reduction in human history. China's rapid industrialization followed the same pattern as earlier developers, but on an unprecedented scale. The country became the world's factory, producing everything from toys to electronics. Chinese cities grew explosively, with megacities like Shenzhen emerging from fishing villages to metropolises of millions in just decades. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, aimed to recreate ancient Silk Road trade routes through massive infrastructure investments. Projects in Asia, Africa, and Europe reflected China's growing global ambitions but also created concerns about debt-trap diplomacy in recipient countries. China's technological advancement accelerated in the 21st century. The country became a leader in renewable energy, high-speed rail, and mobile payments. Companies like Alibaba and Tencent rivaled American tech giants. However, concerns about intellectual property theft and technology transfer created tensions with the United States. The Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 showed the limits of China's political liberalization. The government's violent suppression of the democracy movement established clear boundaries around political dissent. Economic reform continued, but political reform stalled. Hong Kong's return to China in 1997 under the one country, two systems formula was supposed to preserve the territory's autonomy. However, increasing Chinese control led to massive protests in 2019 and the imposition of a national security law that effectively ended Hong Kong's political freedoms. China's treatment of ethnic minorities, particularly Uyghurs in Xinjiang, drew international criticism. Reports of mass detention camps, forced sterilization, and cultural suppression led to accusations of genocide. However, China's economic importance limited international responses. The U.S.-China relationship became increasingly competitive as China's power grew. Trade wars, technology restrictions, and military competition in the South China Sea reflected the challenge of managing the transition from American hegemony to a multipolar world. Environmental awareness grew dramatically in the late 20th century, as the impact of human activities became undeniable. The 1970s saw the first Earth Day, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and landmark legislation like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act in the United States. The discovery of the ozone hole over Antarctica in 1985 showed that human activities could affect the entire planet's atmosphere. The Montreal Protocol, signed in 1987, successfully phased out ozone-depleting substances and remains one of the most successful international environmental agreements. Climate change emerged as the greatest environmental challenge of the modern era. Scientists in the 19th century had identified the greenhouse effect, but it wasn't until the 1980s that clear evidence emerged of human-caused global warming. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, established in 1988, provided scientific consensus on the reality and causes of climate change. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was the first international agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions, but the United States never ratified it, and major developing countries weren't required to reduce emissions. The protocol's limited scope and effectiveness highlighted the challenges of international climate cooperation. Evidence of climate change became increasingly visible in the 21st century. Arctic sea ice declined dramatically, glaciers retreated worldwide, and extreme weather events became more frequent and severe. The hottest years on record all occurred after 2000, with temperatures rising faster than scientists had predicted. The Paris Agreement in 2015 represented a new approach to climate action, with countries making voluntary commitments rather than accepting binding targets. While nearly every country signed the agreement, actual emissions reductions remained insufficient to prevent dangerous climate change. Renewable energy costs plummeted in the 2010s, making solar and wind power competitive with fossil fuels in many markets. This clean energy revolution offered hope for reducing emissions while maintaining economic growth. Electric vehicles also gained acceptance, led by companies like Tesla. Climate activism gained momentum worldwide, particularly among young people. Greta Thunberg's school strike movement inspired millions of students to demand climate action. However, political and economic interests continued to resist the rapid changes needed to address climate change. The concept of the Anthropocene suggested that human activities had fundamentally altered Earth's systems, creating a new geological epoch. This idea reflected growing awareness that humanity had become a planetary force comparable to natural processes like volcanism or asteroid impacts. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks fundamentally changed global security and politics. Al-Qaeda's coordinated attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon killed nearly 3,000 people and demonstrated the vulnerability of even the world's most powerful nation to asymmetric warfare. The immediate response included the invasion of Afghanistan to eliminate Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban government that harbored them. The initial military campaign was successful, but the subsequent occupation became a 20-year conflict that ultimately ended with Taliban victory and American withdrawal in 2021. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified by claims about weapons of mass destruction that proved false, became even more controversial. The removal of Saddam Hussein's government led to sectarian violence and regional instability. The Iraq War damaged American credibility and showed the limits of military power in nation building. The war on terror expanded globally with military operations in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and other countries. Drone strikes became a preferred tool for targeting terrorist leaders, but they also killed civilians and raised legal and ethical questions about extrajudicial killings. Domestic security measures increased dramatically after 9/11. The USA Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers, while new agencies like the Department of Homeland Security were created. Enhanced airport security became routine, symbolizing how terrorism had changed daily life. The detention facility at Guantanamo Bay became a symbol of the moral compromises made in fighting terrorism. The use of torture and indefinite detention without trial contradicted American values and damaged the country's international reputation. The rise of ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, created a new form of terrorism that combined territorial control with global reach. ISIS's sophisticated use of social media to recruit followers and inspire attacks worldwide showed how terrorist organizations adapted to new technologies. Terrorist attacks in major cities: Madrid, 2004, London 2005, Paris 2015, Brussels 2016, and many others, demonstrated that terrorism remained a persistent threat despite massive security investments. These attacks created fear and contributed to the rise of right-wing populist movements. The death of Osama bin Laden in 2011 marked a symbolic victory in the war on terror, but it didn't end the threat of terrorism. New groups emerged and lone wolf attacks inspired by extremist ideologies became increasingly common. Social media platforms fundamentally changed how people communicate, consume information, and understand the world. Facebook's launch in 2004 began as a college networking site, but grew into a global platform connecting over 2 billion people. Its impact on politics, society, and individual psychology continues to unfold. Twitter, launched in 2006, enabled real-time global conversations through short messages. The platform became crucial for breaking news, political communication, and social movements. The Arab Spring protests of 2010-2012 demonstrated social media's power to organize political action, though the long-term results were mixed. YouTube, acquired by Google in 2006, democratized video publishing and created new forms of entertainment and education. Anyone could become a content creator, leading to the rise of influencers who built massive audiences and transformed marketing and celebrity culture. Instagram, launched in 2010, emphasized visual sharing and became particularly popular among younger users. The platform's focus on nude images contributed to concerns about mental health, body image, and social comparison, especially among teenagers. The business model of social media platforms relied on advertising revenue, which created incentives to maximize user engagement. Algorithms designed to keep users scrolling often promoted sensational or divisive content, contributing to political polarization and the spread of misinformation. The 2016 US presidential election revealed social media's political impact. Russian interference through fake accounts and targeted advertising showed how foreign actors could influence democratic processes. The spread of conspiracy theories and false information challenged traditional gatekeepers of information. The concept of filter bubbles described how social media algorithms showed users information that confirmed their existing beliefs, reducing exposure to diverse viewpoints. This contributed to political polarization and made it harder for societies to agree on basic facts. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted both social media's benefits and dangers. Platforms enabled people to stay connected during lockdowns and helped spread public health information. However, they also spread misinformation about vaccines and treatments, potentially contributing to preventable death. Efforts to moderate content created new tensions between free speech and public safety. Decisions to ban political figures, including former President Trump, raised questions about the power of private companies to control public discourse. Different countries developed different approaches to regulating social media. The mental health impacts of social media became increasingly apparent, particularly among young people. Studies linked heavy social media use to depression, anxiety, and sleep problems. The addictive design of these platforms, with features like infinite scroll and push notifications, was compared to gambling and drug addiction. Economic inequality increased dramatically in many countries beginning in the 1980s. The gap between rich and poor widened as globalization, technological change, and policy choices favored capital over labor. The share of income going to the top 1% increased significantly in the United States and other developed countries. The decline of labor unions reduced workers' bargaining power and contributed to stagnant wages for many workers. In the United States, union membership fell from about 30% of workers in the 1950s to less than 11% by 2020. Similar trends occurred in other countries, though some maintained stronger labor protections. Technological change eliminated many middle-class jobs while creating new opportunities for highly skilled workers. Automation reduced demand for manufacturing workers, while the rise of the gig economy created new forms of precarious employment without traditional benefit. The 2008 financial crisis exacerbated inequality as governments bailed out financial institutions while millions of people lost their homes and jobs. The slow recovery and continued growth of wealth inequality contributed to political polarization and the rise of populist movements. The Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 brought attention to economic inequality with the slogan "We are the 99%." The movement spread globally but achieved limited concrete results, highlighting the difficulty of translating social protest into policy change. Technological innovations like cryptocurrencies promised to democratize finance but often created new forms of speculation and inequality. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency enabled some people to become incredibly wealthy while contributing to environmental problems through energy-intensive mining. The COVID-19 pandemic worsened inequality as many low-wage workers lost their jobs while wealthy individuals saw their assets increase in value. The shift to remote work benefited professional workers while essential workers faced health risks for relatively low pay. Universal basic income gained support as a potential solution to technological unemployment and inequality. Pilot programs in various countries tested the idea of providing all citizens with regular unconditional payments, though results were mixed and the idea remained controversial. Housing affordability became a crisis in many cities as real estate prices increased faster than wages. Young people found it increasingly difficult to afford homes, while homelessness increased in many developed countries despite overall prosperity. Medical advances in the late 20th and early 21st centuries extended human lifespan and improved quality of life for millions. The development of new vaccines eliminated or controlled diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries, improved surgical techniques, medical imaging, and pharmaceutical treatments made previously fatal conditions treatable. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, mapped all human genes and opened new possibilities for personalized medicine. Genetic testing could predict disease risks, while gene therapy offered potential cures for genetic disorders. However, these advances also raised ethical questions about genetic privacy and enhancement. The discovery of stem cells and development of regenerative medicine promised to repair damaged tissues and organs. While progress was slower than initially hoped, treatments for some conditions became available, and research continued on more ambitious applications like growing replacement organs. The HIV/AIDS pandemic, first recognized in the 1980s, killed over 36 million people worldwide but also led to advances in antiviral treatments and public health approaches. The development of effective treatments transformed HIV from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition in countries with access to healthcare. However, global health inequalities remained stark. Diseases that were easily treatable in wealthy countries continued to kill millions in poor countries. Malaria, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases disproportionately affected developing countries, while access to basic healthcare remained limited for billions of people. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed weaknesses in global health systems and international cooperation. Despite advances in medical science, the world was unprepared for a respiratory virus that spread rapidly through air travel. Political divisions hindered coordinated responses, while vaccine nationalism limited access to life-saving treatments. Mental health gained increased attention as a public health issue. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions were recognized as major causes of disability worldwide. However, stigma and limited access to treatment meant that many people didn't receive needed care. The opioid crisis in the United States demonstrated how pharmaceutical marketing could create public health disasters. Aggressive promotion of prescription painkillers led to widespread addiction and overdose death. The crisis highlighted the need for better regulation of pharmaceutical companies and more effective addiction treatment. Antibiotic resistance emerged as a major threat to public health as bacteria evolved to resist existing treatments. Overuse of antibiotics in medicine and agriculture contributed to the problem, while pharmaceutical companies had limited incentives to develop new antibiotics. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw dramatic changes in social attitudes and cultural norms. The civil rights movement's success inspired other groups to demand equality and challenge discrimination. Women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and other social movements transformed society in many countries. The women's liberation movement achieved significant legal and social changes, including access to contraception and abortion, equal employment opportunities, and increased participation in politics and professional careers. However, gender inequality persisted in many areas, including wage gaps and underrepresentation in leadership positions. The LGBTQ+ rights movement gained momentum after the Stonewall riots in 1969. Gradual progress included the decriminalization of homosexuality, anti-discrimination laws, and eventually marriage equality in many countries. However, LGBTQ+ people continued to face discrimination and violence in many parts of the world. The disability rights movement challenged assumptions about disability and demanded equal access to education, employment, and public spaces. The Americans with Disabilities Act 1990 became a model for disability rights legislation worldwide, though implementation remained incomplete. Immigration transformed the demographics of many countries, creating more diverse societies but also generating political backlash. Multicultural policies aimed to accommodate different cultures within unified nations, but integration remained challenging. And nativistic movements gained strength in many countries. The Me Too movement, which gained prominence in 2017, challenged sexual harassment and assault by encouraging victims to share their experiences. The movement led to high-profile accountability for powerful men, but also raised questions about due process and the appropriate responses to allegations. Black Lives Matter emerged in 2013 following the killing of Trayvon Martin and gained national prominence after protests in Ferguson, Missouri. The movement challenged police brutality and systemic racism, leading to some policy changes but also generating counter-movements and political polarization. Religious beliefs and practices evolved as societies became more secular in many developed countries. Traditional religious institutions lost members and influence while new forms of spirituality emerged. However, religious fundamentalism also gained strength in many parts of the world, creating tensions between traditional and modern values. Generational differences became more pronounced as technology and social change accelerated. Each generation developed distinct experiences and values, leading to generation gaps in politics, technology use, and social attitudes. The pace of change meant that experiences just a few years apart could be dramatically different. Artificial intelligence evolved from a research curiosity to a transformative technology, affecting every aspect of human life. Machine learning algorithms became capable of recognizing patterns, making predictions, and even creating content that humans couldn't distinguish from human-created work. Deep learning neural networks achieved breakthrough results in image recognition, natural language processing, and gameplay. In 2016, Google's AlphaGo defeated the world champion at Go, a game long considered too complex for computers to master. This victory demonstrated AI's potential to exceed human capabilities in areas requiring intuition and creativity. Large language models like GPT-3 and its successors could generate human-like text on almost any topic. These systems could write essays, create poetry, answer questions, and even engage in seemingly intelligent conversations. However, they also made mistakes and could generate biased or harmful content. AI applications proliferated across industries. Recommendation algorithms influenced what people watched, read, and bought. Facial recognition systems enhanced security but also enabled surveillance. Autonomous vehicles promised to revolutionize transportation, but faced technical and regulatory challenges. The potential benefits of AI were enormous. Medical AI could diagnose diseases more accurately than human doctors. AI tutors could personalize education for each student. Climate models enhanced by AI could better predict and respond to environmental changes. Scientific research accelerated with AI assistance in drug discovery and materials science. However, AI also created new risks and challenges. Job displacement threatened millions of workers as automation expanded beyond manufacturing to services, transportation, and even creative fields. The concentration of AI capabilities in a few large technology companies raised concerns about monopoly power and democratic governance. AI bias reflected the prejudices present in training data and could perpetuate or amplify discrimination. Facial recognition systems worked less accurately for people with darker skin, while hiring algorithms could discriminate against women or minorities. Ensuring AI fairness became a critical challenge. The possibility of artificial general intelligence (AGI) that could match or exceed human capabilities across all domains raised existential questions about humanity's future. Some experts warned that inadequately controlled AGI could pose an existential threat to humanity, while others argued that such concerns were premature. International competition in AI intensified as countries recognized its strategic importance. The United States and China led in AI development, while the European Union focused on AI regulation and ethics. The possibility of an AI arms race raised concerns about stability and cooperation. Space exploration entered a new phase in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as commercial companies joined government agencies in developing space capabilities. The end of the Cold War reduced funding for large government space programs, but private entrepreneurs saw opportunities in the emerging commercial space market. SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk in 2002, revolutionized space launch with reusable rockets that dramatically reduced costs. The company's successful development of the Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon spacecraft demonstrated that private companies could match or exceed government capabilities. SpaceX's plans for Mars colonization captured public imagination and renewed interest in space exploration. The International Space Station became a symbol of international cooperation, bringing together former Cold War adversaries in peaceful scientific research. Astronauts from many countries worked together in orbit, conducting experiments that would be impossible on Earth. The station's continuous human presence in space for over 2 decades represented a milestone in human space exploration. Mars exploration accelerated with increasingly sophisticated robotic missions. NASA's rovers, including Spirit, Opportunity, Curiosity, and Perseverance, provided detailed information about Martian geology and potential for past life. The discovery of water on Mars raised the possibility of future human missions and even permanent settlement. Commercial space ventures expanded beyond government contracts to serve private customers. Companies like Virgin Galactic offered suborbital space tourism, while others planned orbital hotels and manufacturing facilities. The commercialization of space created new opportunities but also raised concerns about space debris and environmental protection. The Artemis program aimed to return humans to the moon and establish a permanent presence there. Unlike the Apollo program's goal of beating the Soviet Union, Artemis emphasized international cooperation and sustainable exploration. Plans included the first woman and first person of color to walk on the moon. Private space companies began deploying large constellations of satellites to provide global internet coverage. SpaceX's Starlink and similar projects promised to bring high-speed internet to remote areas but also raised concerns about space debris and astronomical observations. The search for extraterrestrial life gained new urgency with the discovery of thousands of exoplanets, many in their star's habitable zone where liquid water could exist. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, promised to provide unprecedented views of distant worlds and possibly detect signs of life. Space mining emerged as a potential industry as companies planned to extract valuable minerals from asteroids. The enormous wealth potentially available in space could transform the global economy, but technical challenges and legal questions remained. The biotechnology revolution transformed medicine, agriculture, and our understanding of life itself. The Human Genome Project's completion in 2003 marked the beginning of the genomic era, enabling new approaches to diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease. CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, developed in the 2010s, allowed precise modification of DNA in living cells. This revolutionary tool made genetic engineering faster, cheaper, and more accurate than ever before. CRISPR promised to cure genetic diseases, improve crops, and even reverse aging. The first gene therapies approved for clinical use demonstrated the potential to cure previously incurable genetic disorders. Treatments for inherited blindness, severe immune deficiencies, and sickle cell disease offered hope to patients who had no other options. However, High costs limited access to these life-saving treatments. Synthetic biology emerged as a new field that combined engineering principles with biology to design and build new biological systems. Scientists created artificial DNA sequences, engineered bacteria to produce medicines, and even attempted to create entirely synthetic organisms. Personalized medicine used genetic information to tailor treatments to individual patients. Pharmacogenomics helped predict how patients would respond to different medications, while genetic testing identified disease risks before symptoms appeared. This approach promised more effective treatments with fewer side effects. Agricultural biotechnology developed genetically modified crops that could resist pests, tolerate herbicides, and provide enhanced nutrition. Golden rice, enhanced with vitamin A, could prevent blindness in developing countries. However, concerns about safety and environmental impact led to regulatory restrictions in many countries. The development of mRNA vaccines for COVID-19 demonstrated biotechnology's potential for rapid response to health crises. These vaccines, developed in record time, saved millions of lives and established mRNA as a platform for future vaccine development. Regenerative medicine advanced with stem cell therapies and tissue engineering. Scientists learned to reprogram adult cells into pluripotent stem cells that could develop into any cell type. Three-dimensional bioprinting began creating simple tissues and organs, though complex organs remained beyond current capabilities. Ethical concerns about genetic engineering intensified as capabilities expanded. The birth of gene-edited babies in China in 2018 sparked international condemnation and calls for stricter oversight. Questions about enhancement versus treatment, genetic privacy, and equality of access became increasingly urgent. The 21st century brought undeniable evidence of human impact on Earth's climate systems. Global temperatures rose faster than predicted, Arctic ice melted at accelerating rates, and extreme weather events became more frequent and severe. The scientific consensus on human-caused climate change became overwhelming. The Anthropocene concept gained acceptance as scientists documented how human activities had fundamentally altered Earth's systems. Plastic pollution, habitat destruction, and species extinction occurred at unprecedented rates. The notion that humans had become a geological force comparable to volcanoes or asteroids reshaped environmental thinking. Youth climate activism surged as young people faced the prospect of inheriting a degraded planet. Greta Thunberg's school strike movement inspired millions of students worldwide to demand action on climate change. The phrase, "How dare you," became a rallying cry for intergenerational climate justice. Renewable energy experienced dramatic cost reductions and deployment. Solar photovoltaic costs fell by over 90% between 2010 and 2020, making it the cheapest electricity source in many markets. Wind power also became cost competitive with fossil fuels. However, the intermittent nature of renewable energy required advances in storage and grid management. Electric vehicles gained mainstream acceptance as battery technology improved and costs declined. Tesla's success encouraged traditional automakers to develop electric models, while several countries announced plans to ban internal combustion engines. However, the transition faced challenges including charging infrastructure and battery mineral supply chains. Carbon pricing mechanisms, including carbon taxes and cap-and-trade systems, were implemented in many jurisdictions to internalize the costs of greenhouse gas emissions. However, coverage remained incomplete, and prices were often too low to drive significant emission reductions. Nature-based solutions gained recognition as essential complements to technological approaches to climate change. Reforestation, wetland restoration, and regenerative agriculture could sequester carbon while providing other environmental benefits. However, these solutions faced challenges including land use conflicts and measurement difficulties. Climate adaptation became an urgent priority as the impacts of climate change became unavoidable. Cities invested in flood defenses, heat-resistant infrastructure, and emergency preparedness. However, adaptation was expensive and unequally distributed, with poor countries and communities facing the greatest risks. The concept of tipping points in Earth's climate system raised concerns about irreversible changes that could accelerate warming. The collapse of ice sheets, release of methane from permafrost, and dieback of forests could create feedback loops that would make climate change unstoppable. International climate negotiations achieved some progress but remained insufficient to prevent dangerous warming. The Paris Agreement represented unprecedented global cooperation, but relied on voluntary commitments that fell short of what scientists said was necessary to limit warming to safe levels. As we enter the third decade of the 21st century, humanity faces challenges and opportunities unlike any in our history. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated both our vulnerability and our resilience, showing how quickly global systems could be disrupted, but also how rapidly we could develop solutions when necessity demanded. The convergence of multiple technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, renewable energy, and space technology, promises transformations as significant as the Industrial Revolution. Quantum computing could revolutionize information processing, while fusion energy might provide abundant, clean power. Brain-computer interfaces could treat neurological disorders and enhance human capabilities. However, these advances also create new risks and uncertainties. The concentration of technological power in a few companies and countries raises questions about governance and inequality. The pace of change makes it difficult for institutions and individuals to adapt, creating social and political stress. Climate change remains the overarching challenge of our time, requiring unprecedented global cooperation and transformation of energy, transportation, and agricultural systems. The window for limiting warming to manageable levels is rapidly closing, demanding immediate and sustained action on a scale never before attempted. The rise of artificial intelligence could bring enormous benefits, but also risks that we don't fully understand. The possibility of artificial general intelligence that exceeds human capabilities in all domains could transform civilization in ways we can barely imagine. Ensuring that these developments benefit all of humanity rather than a privileged few will require careful planning and international cooperation. Space exploration and settlement could make humanity a multi-planetary species, reducing the risk of extinction from earthbound catastrophes. The resources of the solar system could provide abundance for all, while the challenge of space exploration could unite humanity around common goals. Biotechnology could eliminate genetic diseases, extend healthy human lifespan, and enhance human capabilities. However, these advances also raise profound questions about human nature, equality, and what it means to be human. The choices we make about genetic engineering and human enhancement will shape the future of our species. The story of human civilization is one of continuous change, adaptation, and progress in the face of challenges. Our species has survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and natural disasters. We have created art, literature, and music that speaks across cultures and centuries. We have developed systems of knowledge that allow us to understand our universe from the quantum level to cosmic scales. As we face an uncertain future, we carry with us the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of human experience. The stories of Gilgamesh and the Epic of Homer, the teachings of Buddha and Confucius, the discoveries of Galileo and Newton, and the struggles for freedom and justice throughout history all inform our understanding of what it means to be human. The future remains unwritten, shaped by the choices we make today. We have the knowledge and tools to create a future of abundance, sustainability, and human flourishing. Whether we will do so depends on our wisdom, our commitment to the common good, and our ability to work together across all the divisions that have historically separated us. Like our ancestors who built the first cities, discovered agriculture, and reached for the stars, we stand at a threshold. The next chapter of human history is ours to write. The story continues, and we are all its authors. The greatest adventure in human history may still lie ahead.